In 1972, the U.S. Department of the Interior quietly outlawed the digging of a wild root that working-class American grandmothers had been pulling out of Appalachian hillsides every September for almost 90 years. They called it conservation. The grandmothers called it Sunday tea. Hazel in the woods east of Akron, Ohio, kept doing it anyway. She walked 3 miles into the forest every Sunday morning of the Depression and came home with enough wild ginseng, sassafras root, and bloodroot to keep the family doctored through winter. Modern ethnobotanists now confirm the grandmothers harvested in patterns that actually grew the wild stands stronger. The lobbying came from pharmaceutical companies who wanted those compounds patented. Number 18 was felony prosecuted in 1996. Number 11 became a federal offense the same year wild ramps showed up on a Manhattan menu. Number 3 is still legal in 2 states and prosecuted in 48. These 25 wilderness tricks weren't lost because the woods stopped giving. They were lost because somebody got rich the moment your grandmother forgot how to walk into them. Hit subscribe. What you are about to learn is not survival fantasy. It is American history. Number 25. Wild American Ginseng. In 1933, Hazel walked 5 miles into the second-growth hardwood east of Akron every September with a forked digging stick and a flour sack. She knew the plant by the cluster of red berries and the 5-fingered leaves. A pound of dried wild root sold for $9, almost a week of factory wages. Hazel left every plant younger than 4 years untouched and replanted the seed berries in the same hole. Her own grandmother had taught her in 1892. In 1975, wild ginseng was added to Appendix 2 of the CITES Treaty. By 1995, digging without a state license carried fines up to $10,000. The pharmaceutical industry lobbied for the restrictions and now patents ginsenicide compounds. Your great-grandmother dug the root that paid the November coal bill. The state now calls her a poacher. Sassafras root foraging in national forests. Hazel pulled sassafras saplings every April in the Wayne National Forest hollows. She knew the tree by the mitten-shaped leaves and the root beer smell when she snapped a twig. A bundle of fresh roots steeped in 2 gallons of spring water became the family's blood tonic. Margaret remembered the smell in her grandmother's kitchen. Boiled sassafras roots in a blue speckled enamel pot. The whole house smelled of root beer for 2 days. In 1960, the FDA banned saffrole after rat studies at extreme doses. The Forest Service followed in 1968 by classifying root pulling as damaging extraction in 18 national forests. Soft drink corporations had already reformulated to artificial flavor. Hazel pulled the root that cured a cough for $2 worth of digging time. The Forest Service never reissued the permits. Wild ramps and leaks digging. Every April, Hazel walked the wet creek bottoms of the Cuyahoga Valley with a paring knife and a bushel basket. The ramps grew in dense green carpets, long flat leaves like lily of the valley, with a sharp garlic onion bulb under 3 inches of black mountain soil. A single hour filled the basket. She fried them in bacon grease and pickled them in cider vinegar for the winter. Margaret ate them at age 8 and remembered the taste, wilder than any onion, for the rest of her life. In 2004, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park banned all ramp digging. Most state forests in West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina now require permits. The lobbying came from urban restaurant chefs who had begun selling ramps at $30 a pound. Your great-grandmother dug a basket of wild leeks on a Saturday morning. The Park Service now arrests for the same act. Trapping wildlife outside official seasons. Hazel's husband ran a trap line through the woods east of Akron from October through March of every Depression winter. He set leg-hold traps for muskrat along the creek, snares for cottontail rabbits, and deadfalls for raccoon under the hickory trees. A single winter's pelts brought in $47 from the fur buyer's wagon. Margaret remembered the smell of cedar shavings and stretched fur from her grandfather's woodshed. By the 1970s, federal and state wardens enforced strict season dates and trap-type restrictions. Hobby trapping outside the 4-month state season became a misdemeanor. Your great-grandfather paid the family's coal bill with winter pelts pulled outside the official calendar. The state now considers the same trap line a wildlife violation. Slingshot and snare hunting. Hazel's brother hunted squirrel, rabbit, and the occasional grouse with a hand-cut hickory slingshot through the Depression years. Steel ball bearings cost a penny apiece. A Saturday morning produced 4 squirrels and 2 rabbits, 3 cents in ammunition. Neither slingshot nor snare required a rifle license, ammunition stamps, or a hunting tag. The grandfathers taught the boys at age 10. By 2012, 33 states prohibited slingshot use on game animals. Snare hunting was banned in 28 states. The lobbying came from sport hunting organizations and ammunition manufacturers who preferred regulated firearm seasons. Your great-grandfather fed his family on 3 cents of steel ball bearings. The state now requires a $50 firearms permit and a $40 season license to take the same squirrel. Wild medicinal herb collection, bloodroot, mayapple, and golden seal. Hazel walked the Cuyahoga Valley every May with a wicker basket. Bloodroot grew on shaded slopes with a thick orange-red root that bled when cut. Golden seal grew in deep leaf litter with a yellow root the price of gold. She made bloodroot salve for ringworm, brewed mayapple root tea as a purgative, and dried golden seal for sore throats. The whole season's harvest cost nothing and treated the family for a year. Golden seal was added to CITES Appendix 2 in 1997. Bloodroot and mayapple are protected in 12 state forests. Pharmaceutical companies have since patented sanguinarine, podophyllitoxin, and berberine, the active compounds. Hazel's basket treated 5 children for a year. The same compounds now sell as patent drugs at a 1,000-fold markup. Tree sap tapping on federal land. Every February through April, Hazel's father drilled small holes into the sugar maples along the Wayne National Forest Fire Road. He hammered in galvanized spiles and hung tin sap buckets. A run of 40 trees produced 80 gallons of sap and yielded 2 gallons of dark amber syrup over 3 weeks of boiling. Margaret remembered the smell of wood smoke and sweet steam from the syrup camp at age 8. By 2005, most national forests had eliminated public sap tapping permits entirely, citing concession contract obligations to commercial syrup producers. The commercial syrup industry quietly funded the lobbying. Your great-grandfather boiled syrup in the open woods for the Christmas pancakes. The Forest Service now contracts the same maple trees to a commercial bottler. Birch bark, stripping in national forests. Every June, Hazel's brother walked into the paper birch stands of northern Pennsylvania with a sharp pocket knife and a coil of cedar lashing. He scored the bark in a horizontal cut, peeled long curling sheets, and rolled them home. A 6-foot canoe required 28 square feet of intact bark. He built one canoe every other summer. The hull was sewn with split spruce root. The seams were sealed with pine pitch and beeswax. The whole canoe weighed 38 pounds. By 1996, large-scale bark removal carried federal felony charges under timber theft statutes. The lobbying came from lumber mill operators who wanted the bark sold to industrial decorative veneer plants. Your great-grandfather built a canoe from a tree he never cut down. The Forest Service now prosecutes the same bark stripping as timber theft. Wild fishing with hand-woven willow traps. Hazel's father set willow-with fish traps in the Cuyahoga Creek every May. The traps were funnel-mouthed baskets, 3 feet long, woven over an oak frame, baited with cornmeal in a cheesecloth bag. A single trap produced 10 pounds of catfish, sunfish, and bullhead overnight. Margaret remembered her grandfather wading the creek barefoot at dawn to lift the traps. By 1973, fish trap use was a misdemeanor in 41 states. Rod and reel only requirements pushed the willow trap into extinction. Your great-grandfather caught a winter's worth of fish in a basket woven from a tree on the bank. The state now requires a license and a daily creel limit for the same catch. Wild game, roasted over open fire. Hazel's husband shot a white-tailed deer every November in the second-growth hardwoods east of Akron. He built a hardwood coal fire in a small clearing, drove a green oak spit through the loin, and roasted the meat for 4 hours over coals. Margaret tasted her first roasted deer at age 6, sitting on a folded canvas tarp in the November leaves. By 1995, dispersed area fires were banned in 56 national forests. The lobbying came from insurance companies after the 1988 Yellowstone fires. Your great-grandfather roasted a wild deer over a fire he built where he killed it. The Forest Service now requires a metal ring, a designated site, and a written permit. Acorn flour, processing for sale. Every October, Hazel and her daughters walked the white oak groves east of Akron with grain sacks. They gathered 50 pounds of fallen acorns in a single afternoon, leached the bitter tannins through cold spring water over 4 days, and ground the dried meats into a sweet, brown, gluten-free flour. A loaf of acorn bread had a nutty, almost chestnut flavor. Hazel sold 10-pound sacks to neighbors for 30 cents each. By 2015, 38 states classified acorn flour sales as a regulated food processing operation requiring inspections, water quality testing, and commercial kitchen permits. Your great-grandmother turned a free-fall harvest into 30 cents a sack. The state now requires a $4,000 commercial kitchen build-out for the same sale. Cattail, gathering on protected wetlands. Every June, Hazel waded into the marsh edges of the Cuyahoga floodplain with a serrated knife and a feed sack. She cut young cattail shoots for salads, harvested the green spike for boiling like corn on the cob, and gathered the gold pollen in July for pancake flour. The plant gave food in 5 different forms across 4 seasons. Margaret remembered her grandmother slicing cattail hearts into a cast-iron skillet, the kitchen smelling like fresh cucumber. The Clean Water Act of 1972 extended federal jurisdiction over wetlands. By the 1990s, state wetland conservation laws required harvest permits. Most public wetlands now ban any plant collection entirely. Your great-grandmother fed the family from a wetland she walked into for free. The Army Corps of Engineers now requires a written permit for the same harvest. Spring water collection, for sale. A small, clear spring bubbled out of a hillside east of Akron. Hazel's father cleared the seep in 1920, lined the basin with flat sandstone slabs, and capped it with a wooden lid. He bottled the water in glass mason jars and sold 10 gallons a week to neighbors for 15 cents a gallon. The income paid for shoes through the worst Depression years. By 2009, state environmental agencies required source water permits, quarterly testing, and watershed protection reports for any spring water sale across property lines. The lobbying came from corporate bottled water producers who controlled the wholesale market. Your great-grandfather sold pure Ridge Spring water for 15 cents a gallon. The FDA now requires 12 permits and a $20,000 testing schedule for the same operation. Wild venison home curing for sale. Every November, Hazel's husband shot 2 white-tailed deer east of Akron. He hung the carcasses in the cellar smokehouse, dry cured the hams in salt and brown sugar for 6 weeks, then cold smoked them over hickory chips for 10 days. A finished ham weighed 18 pounds. He sold 3 every winter to neighbors who did not hunt for $2.50 each. The income bought a new pair of work boots every January. State laws by the 1970s banned all commercial sale of wild venison entirely, even within the same county. By the 1990s, USDA inspection requirements made even non-commercial gifting a regulatory gray zone. Your great-grandfather sold a smoked wild ham for the price of a pair of boots. The state now classifies the same sale as a felony wildlife violation. Tanning wild hides with white oak bark. Every winter, Hazel's husband stripped white oak bark from blowdown trees, ground it in a hand-crank stone mill, and steeped the bark dust in a wooden vat behind the woodshed. Deer hides, raccoon pelts, and squirrel skins from his trap line soaked in the tannic acid solution for 4 to 10 weeks. Margaret remembered the smell of oak bark tannin, sharp, bitter, like strong black tea. In 1976, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act classified tannic acid waste as a regulated effluent. By 1988, state environmental agencies required permits and waste disposal documentation for any home tannery. Your great-grandfather tanned a deer hide with bark from a fallen tree. The EPA now requires 3 permits and a hazardous waste contractor. Wild persimmon and pawpaw foraging. Every October, Hazel walked the floodplain woods east of Akron with a willow basket. The wild persimmons hung in orange clusters, almost custard sweet after the first frost. The pawpaws grew in shaded river bottoms, green, mango-shaped, with a creamy yellow flesh that tasted like tropical fruit. Margaret tasted her first pawpaw at age 7 and never forgot the buttery sweetness. The Indiana Department of Natural Resources made wild pawpaw harvesting a permit-required activity in 1998. Several state forests now ban removal of fruit, seed, or wood. The lobbying came from commercial pawpaw breeders who wanted the genetic stock controlled. Your great-grandmother filled 2 baskets with fruit no grocery has ever sold. The state now requires a permit for the same harvest. Wild grain gleaning on federal grazing land. Through the Depression years, Hazel's cousin in western Kansas walked the post-harvest wheat fields and the open prairie of the federal Taylor Grazing Act lands every August. She gathered fallen wheat heads, wild rye, Indian ricegrass, and pigweed seed in a canvas apron. A single afternoon yielded 5 pounds of mixed wild grain. She ground it in a cast-iron coffee mill and baked it into rough brown loaves. By the 1970s, Bureau of Land Management rules classified all plant collection on federal grazing land as requiring permits, including post-harvest gleaning of cultivated fields adjacent to federal lease land. Commercial wheat buyer organizations lobbied for the restriction. Your great-aunt fed her family on grain other people had walked past. The Bureau of Land Management now requires a written permit for the same gleaning. Black walnut, foraging on state forest land. Every October, Hazel walked the hardwood ridges of the Cuyahoga Valley with a burlap sack and a hammer. The black walnuts fell in green hulls the size of tennis balls. She gathered 50 pounds in a single afternoon and dried the shelled nuts on a screen in the loft. The cracked nuts went into walnut bread, walnut pies, and the Christmas fudge. A pound of finished walnut meats sold for 40 cents to the bakery on Market Street in Akron. By 2008, 12 state forests required permits with annual harvest caps. The lobbying came from commercial walnut meat processors. Your great-grandmother filled a sack with the harvest of a tree on public land. The state now requires a permit and an annual cap. Wild mushroom, hunting on federal land. Every May, Hazel walked the burned slopes of the Wayne National Forest with a basket and a paring knife. She knew morels by the honeycomb cap, chanterelles by the apricot smell, and chicken of the woods by the orange shelf form on dead oak. A single morning produced 4 pounds of edible fungi. Margaret tasted her first morel at age 8, earthy, smoky, almost meaty. In 1992, the Forest Service began requiring permits for mushroom collection on national forest land. By 2015, commercial collection required separate permits with seasonal limits and harvest caps. The lobbying came from commercial wild mushroom buyers who wanted controlled supply. Your great-grandmother filled a basket with mushrooms in the same woods she had foraged for 60 years. The Forest Service now charges $50 for the same morning's harvest. Staghorn sumac as cooking spice. Every August, Hazel cut the dark red drooping fruit clusters from the staghorn sumac trees along the country roadsides east of Akron. She rubbed the velvety berries through a flour sack cloth, then steeped them in cold water. The infusion produced a tart, lemonade-pink drink. She also dried and ground the berries into a tangy red spice for grilled meat. In 1986, the FDA issued advisory warnings about staghorn sumac after consumer confusion with poison sumac. By 2012, 22 states classified wild sumac sales as requiring an unsaleable plant license. Cooking school chefs replaced the wild spice with imported Mediterranean varieties. Your great-grandmother spiced the Sunday roast with a roadside fruit. The FDA now warns against the same plant. Wild stinging nettle, harvesting on protected land. Every April, Hazel walked the wet spring woods with leather garden gloves and a paring knife. She cut the young nettle tops, the first 6 inches of new growth, into a folded apron. The stinging hairs collapsed when steamed, leaving a green, spinach-like vegetable rich in iron and vitamin C. She made nettle soup with a quart of broth and a quartered potato. She steamed nettle tops with butter for the Easter dinner. By 2005, 11 state parks required permits for any nettle collection. The lobbying came from commercial herbal supplement companies who had begun marketing concentrated nettle extracts for prostate health and allergy relief. Your great-grandmother turned a stinging weed into the spring tonic dinner. The supplement industry now charges $20 for the same nutrients in capsules. Wild honey, gathering from hollow trees. Every July, Hazel's brother climbed the hollow basswood and beech trees in the Wayne National Forest to take wild honeycomb from feral colonies. He worked at dawn before the bees warmed, smoked the entrance with a smoldering bundle of rotten wood, cut the comb out with a long-bladed knife, and lowered it down in a wooden bucket. A single hollow tree yielded 30 pounds of dark wildflower honey, with notes of basswood, clover, and goldenrod. Margaret remembered the woodsy, almost smoky aftertaste. In 1973, the U.S. Forest Service classified wild bee tree harvesting as damaging extraction on federal land. By the 1990s, 21 states required permits for any wild honey collection from public land trees. State apiculture boards lobbied at the urging of commercial beekeepers. Your great-grandfather brought home 30 pounds of wild honey for the price of a bee sting. The Forest Service now considers the same harvest a federal violation. Wild birch and poplar syrup tapping for sale. Through the Depression years, Hazel's father tapped paper birches and yellow birches in northern Pennsylvania every March. The birch sap ran 4 weeks later than maple, with a thinner, more mineral flavor. He boiled 40 gallons of sap down to 1 gallon of dark, molasses-like syrup over an open fire. He sold the finished syrup at the Akron farmers market for 60 cents a pint, almost double the maple syrup price. The buyers were European immigrants who recognized the flavor from the old country. The whole season paid the spring property tax. By 2006, USDA cottage food rules required certified evaporators, batch testing, and label compliance. The lobbying came from established maple syrup cooperatives. A single homemade bottle sold across state lines is now a federal felony. Your great-grandfather sold birch syrup to pay the spring property tax. The USDA now requires 14 forms and a certified evaporator. The maple lobby owns the season. Wild fur processing and sale. Through the Depression winters, Hazel's husband ran a trap line that produced about 200 pelts a season. Muskrat, raccoon, red fox, mink, and the occasional bobcat. He stretched, fleshed, and air-cured each pelt in the woodshed. He sold the bundle to the traveling fur buyer's wagon every March for almost $300 in 1933, a year's coal money for the family. The Lacey Act of 1899, the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, and the Endangered Species Act of 1973 progressively restricted wild fur commerce. State trapper license, fur dealer license, and inspection requirements added cost layers through the 1980s. By 2000, the working-class winter trapper had been licensed out of existence. Your great-grandfather walked into a March market with a year's coal money in pelts. The state now requires 4 licenses and 3 federal permits for the same bundle. Hazel's Depression Wilderness Year. This was the system that fed and clothed and doctored the family. In 1933, Margaret was 8, growing up in a small wooden house on the south side of Akron, Ohio. Her grandmother, Hazel, born in 1892, lived a quarter-mile out of town on the wooded edge of the Cuyahoga Valley. Hazel's homestead touched almost every wilderness skill on this list, every single month of the year. In March, the birch trees and sugar maples were tapped. The boil fire burned for 3 weeks. In April, Hazel walked the wet creek bottoms for ramps and stinging nettle, dug sassafras roots, and gathered morels on the burned slopes of the Wayne National Forest. In May, she pulled bloodroot, mayapple, and golden seal from the deep leaf litter. In June, she waded the marsh edges for cattail hearts and set wooden traps for catfish. In July, her brother climbed a hollow basswood for 30 pounds of wild honey. In August, she cut staghorn sumac for the Sunday spice. Her cousin in Kansas gleaned wild grain on federal grazing land. In September, she walked 5 miles into the hardwood for ginseng. The September pelt money paid the November coal bill. In October, she filled 2 baskets with persimmons and pawpaws, gathered black walnuts and leached acorn tannins through cold spring water. In November, her husband shot 2 deer, cured the hams in salt and hickory smoke, and started the trap line that ran through March. In December, she tanned a deer hide in white oak bark behind the woodshed. By the time Margaret was raising Eleanor in 1972, half of Hazel's wilderness year had been technically banned, taxed, or licensed out of existence. By the time Eleanor was telling the stories to her own grandchildren in 1995, almost all of them carried federal or state penalties. The full Depression wilderness year cannot be operated today. The ginseng requires a permit. The ramps are protected. The birch syrup requires a certified evaporator. The fir requires 4 licenses. The honey tree is a federal violation. Hazel's grandchildren remember the smell of wood smoke and damp leaf mold and oak bark tannin. Her great-grandchildren never will. That is the wilderness year. That is number 1. That is what the Forest Service, the FDA, the pharmaceutical companies, the timber industry, and the commercial food lobby quietly took away, one wilderness skill at a time over the course of 90 years. When you walk into a quiet patch of woods today and find a single morel pushing through the mayleaf litter, the permits are tighter, the seasons are stricter, and the rangers are closer than anything Hazel ever faced. That is the trade. Most of it was conservation, some of it was corporate, but somewhere in the loss is a way of walking through the woods that you cannot recover. The smell of wood smoke from the November deer fire, the taste of wild honey scraped from a basswood hollow, the rhythm of a grandmother who fed her family on what the woods, the marsh, and the September hillside were willing to give. Hazel saw it. Anna learned it. Margaret remembered it. Eleanor heard the stories. Their grandchildren will not. Try one of these this week, just one. Walk an old country road and find a single staghorn sumac cluster. Gather a handful of fallen black walnuts, steep a single sassafras root, and breathe in the smell of 1933. If your grandmother is still living, call her this week. Ask her what the Forest Service now requires a permit for that her own mother did with a basket and a paring knife. The window is smaller than any of us would like to believe. These are not lost wilderness tricks. They are quietly forbidden ones.